When we think of colonial America, we imagine stern-faced Puritans, modest women in bonnets, and communities bound by God, discipline, and hard work. But the truth behind those wooden walls and candle-lit sermons were secrets, desires, and social norms so strange and provocative they'd never make it into your school books. This wasn't just a land of faith. It was a place where young couples shared beds before marriage, where 1 in 3 brides were already pregnant, and where public whippings were a regular part of everyday morality. From strange sleeping rituals to shocking public punishments, from secret abortions to legal common law marriages, the American colonies were filled with contradictions, a society torn between strict religious law and raw human nature. Let's take you back over 200 years and uncover the weird, wild, and deeply human truths about life in early America, starting with one of the most intimate and awkward traditions of all. In colonial America, strict religious codes ruled the public sphere, but behind closed doors, things were a bit more complicated. One of the strangest customs of the time was called bundling, and yes, it meant exactly what it sounds like: 2 unmarried teenagers, 1 bed, 1 night, 1 test of will. In many rural communities, when a young man showed interest in a girl, he was allowed, even encouraged, to spend the night with her, not in a separate room, not on a distant couch, but in her bed. Her parents were usually just 1 room away. Sometimes they watched the couple from the doorway, and to preserve modesty, a wooden board, called a bundling board, was placed between the two, or, in some cases, the couple would be sewn into their own separate blankets from the waist down to stop them from touching. But here's the thing, they were teenagers, it was winter, and they were alone, all night. You can imagine how often the bundling board accidentally got kicked over. Despite the puritanical image we associate with the era, bundling was shockingly common, especially in New England, Pennsylvania, and New York. Even inns practiced bundling for travelers, allowing strangers to share a bed with nothing more than a fabric divider, all in the name of practicality. It was a test of compatibility, warmth, and in many cases, temptation. What began as a way to prevent premarital sex often turned into the very opportunity for it, setting off a chain of consequences that would ripple through families and churches alike. So what happened after bundling night? Well, a lot of weddings suddenly got moved up, because in colonial America, getting pregnant before marriage wasn't rare, it was normal. In fact, historians estimate that nearly 1 in 3 brides in pre-revolution America were already visibly pregnant on their wedding day. And this wasn't just in one region. From Puritan Massachusetts, to Quaker Pennsylvania, to aristocratic Charleston, it was happening everywhere. Even across the Atlantic, in the so-called mother country of England, nearly half of all brides were pregnant when they said their vows. It turns out that despite all the religious lectures, the reality of human desire had a different plan. But here's what makes it even more interesting. Marriage at the time was rarely about love. It was a business deal, negotiated between families, a union based on property, reputation, and survival. A young man's wealth, land, or potential to earn often mattered more than whether the girl actually wanted to marry him. So when a pregnancy happened out of wedlock, it threw everything into chaos. Weddings had to be arranged fast, reputations had to be protected, and sometimes punishments had to be handed out. Because while these practices were common, they weren't always forgiven. Colonial America didn't just believe in rules, it believed in punishment, public, harsh, humiliating. When moral laws were broken, especially when it came to sex, the consequences were designed to send a message. A young woman who got pregnant outside of marriage could be paraded through town on an ox cart, wearing a shame placard that read uncleanness. Her partner might be tied to a whipping post, stripped to the waist, and lashed, sometimes in front of the very church he had once attended. In some cases, Offenders were locked into wooden stocks, exposed for days, while the townspeople walked past, watching. One woman, caught in an affair with a Native American man, was publicly beaten and forced to wear a label announcing her sin every time she stepped outside, and if she dared to appear without it, she was marked permanently, right on her face. The courts didn't just punish, they wanted people to carry their shame in front of neighbors, children, and God. These weren't isolated incidents. They were everyday justice in a world where the Bible was law, and deviation from it meant you weren't just wrong, you were wicked. Even so, punishment didn't stop the sin. If anything, it fueled the tension, the secrecy, the hunger for rebellion. Because in a society where desire was forbidden, desire didn't die, it went underground. For all the fire and brimstone sermons in the churches, colonial America had another kind of preacher, one that spoke in whispers, behind closed shutters, in alleyways slick with mud. Because where there were men, there were brothels, and where there were brothels, there was profit. In small towns, prostitution was frowned upon, sometimes punished. But in the port cities, it was thriving. Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, New York. These weren't just colonies, they were trade hubs. Ships rolled in with sailors from Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean, all looking for drink, dice, and women. So behind respectable inns and taverns were places known as disorderly houses, to code for brothels. Inside, women, often indentured servants or widows with no other choice, worked for cash or protection. Some brothels were dirty, dangerous, and dim. Others catered to upper-class men, serving wine, cards, and clean bedsheets, promising discretion and safety from disease. Even Benjamin Franklin, known for his wit and wisdom, hid risque jokes and double meanings in his writing. He understood the truth. Wherever men pretend to be pure, lust finds a way. Helltown, a district in Philadelphia, became notorious. No red lights, no neon signs, just whispered directions, candlelit windows, and the knowledge that if you knocked 3 times, someone would answer. In today's world, the topic of abortion sparks fierce debate, but in colonial America, it was common, it was legal, and it was handled almost entirely by women. As long as it took place before quickening, the first time a mother felt the baby move, abortion was not just tolerated, it was expected in certain situations. Why? Because survival came first. Families already struggling to feed their children knew that another mouth could mean starvation. So when pregnancies happened unexpectedly, especially outside of marriage, the decision often fell to the women, and the women alone. There were no hospitals, no doctors. Instead, there were midwives, wise, trusted women, who knew how to brew herbs, read bodies, and protect secrets. Using natural ingredients, like pennyroyal, tansy, and black cohosh, they quietly ended pregnancies for women who weren't ready, or couldn't afford, to become mothers. It wasn't seen as murder. It wasn't even seen as controversial, it was seen as necessary. And despite the presence of strict preachers and colonial laws, communities often turned a blind eye, not out of sin, but out of understanding. Because in early America, the role of a woman was complicated. She was expected to be pure, modest, and obedient, but at the same time, she was forced to be strong, resourceful, and silent. The midwife stood at that intersection, the keeper of life, and sometimes, the quiet guardian of ending it. In colonial America, the word sodomy carried weight, not just as a sin, but as a sentence. Same-sex relationships weren't just taboo, they were criminal. In places like Plymouth and Connecticut, the punishment could be death. And yet, those relationships still happened. They happened in barns, in ships, in secret bedrooms, among farmhands, soldiers and apprentices. They happened because beneath the layers of law and scripture, human desire still breathed. By the mid-1600s, records show men brought to trial for what the courts called unnatural acts. Some were sentenced, others quietly warned. In many cases, The courts hesitated to enforce the harshest penalties, not because they were merciful, but because too many cases kept coming. As the colonies grew, and labor became scarce, the law bent toward usefulness. A man who could work was more valuable than a man hanged in the name of morality. But silence did not mean acceptance. It meant fear. It meant living two lives, one by daylight and one behind drawn curtains. Even during the American Revolution, one of General George Washington's most valuable foreign advisers, Baron von Steuben, was rumored to be gay. Benjamin Franklin knew it. So did Congress. And yet, they welcomed him. Because war doesn't care who you love. It only cares whether you can lead. Still, for most men who lived outside the norm, there was no refuge. Only coded letters, stolen moments, and secrets taken to the grave. We imagine colonial America as a place of piety, church bells, family Bibles, and silence at supper. But buried beneath floorboards, hidden behind cupboard walls, were books and letters that revealed something very different. Pornography. Yes, pornography existed in the colonies. It wasn't the explicit photography we know today, but it was there. Illustrated letters, graphic poetry, short stories, and plays filled with lustful characters and forbidden situations. Some of it was smuggled from Europe, but much of it was written locally, often with a moral or religious tone, meant to justify the arousal it created. Even Benjamin Franklin, printer, philosopher, and founding father, included hidden risque humor in his writings. He believed pleasure was natural, even necessary, though he cloaked it in clever wit. But not everyone agreed. Clergymen raged from the pulpit, warning that even reading such content could lead to the sin of self-pollution. Masturbation was not just frowned upon, it was seen as a moral sickness. One man in Springfield, Massachusetts, was actually whipped in public after being caught in a churchyard, pleasuring himself behind a stone wall. The reason? He'd been reading something described only as lascivious. And then there were the books that took things further. Written accounts of Native American sexual customs, plantation breeding, and forbidden interracial encounters, often exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Some of these stories were circulated in the anti-slavery North, combining erotic fantasy with political outrage. It was propaganda, and it was also pornography, hidden, whispered about, passed hand to hand. Colonial America may have worn a cross on its chest, but it often carried desire in its coat pocket. In a time without microscopes, antibiotics, or modern medicine, desire came at a cost, and its name was syphilis. Known then as the Great Pox, syphilis was one of the most feared diseases in colonial America. It disfigured, it lingered, and it whispered its warnings in the shadows of brothels, ships, and backrooms. Though colonial governments worked hard to control public morality, they had no defense against the spread of venereal disease. British ships brought infected sailors. Brothels welcomed travelers from every shore. And in the crowded, candlelit taverns of Boston and Philadelphia, it spread quickly, passed between strangers, lovers, and sometimes even within marriages. There were no cures, only herbal tinctures, leeches, and false remedies sold by hopeful apothecaries. By the mid-1700s, colonial newspapers were filled with ads promising fast relief or miraculous powders that in truth did little more than numb the pain. Temporarily, men and women hid their sores, covered their shame, and prayed no one would notice. But the signs were clear: scarring, madness, stillbirths. Doctors didn't fully understand it. Preachers called it a punishment from God, and still it spread. Even before the birth of the United States, syphilis had become one of the most deadly and persistent diseases in the colonies. Not because the people were evil, but because the people were human. They fell in love. They made mistakes. They searched for pleasure in a world that told them to be ashamed of wanting it. Not every couple in colonial America walked down a church aisle. Some fell in love outside the system, without permission, without blessing,
without approval, and still chose to live as husband and wife. It was called common law marriage, and in many places it was not only accepted, it was legally binding. If a couple spoke vows aloud, promised themselves to each other, and lived together, even without a priest or papers, the union was recognized by many colonial courts. This wasn't just for peasants or outcasts. Even wealthy young women used it to escape arranged marriages, choosing poor but honest men over rich suitors handpicked by their families. In southern states like Virginia, the practice of hand fasting, holding hands and swearing loyalty replaced church bells and organ music, and if a child was born during that time, it didn't bring scandal. It often sealed the bond, legally, socially and spiritually, because behind the iron laws and dusty sermons was something deeper, something that even the harshest judge couldn't crush: the human urge to choose love for oneself. Narrative. Final reflection. Calm, powerful, thoughtful. Colonial America was a land of contradictions. They built gallows beside churches, sewed shame into women's clothing, and preached purity from pulpits, while brothels bloomed down the street. But they were not so different from us. They were afraid, they were passionate, they were curious. They broke rules, made rules, and rewrote them again. They punished desire, then quietly practiced it. In the end, the story of colonial America isn't just about founding fathers or revolution. It's about what people did in the dark, what they hoped no one would see, and what they did even when everyone was watching. Because that's not just history, that's humanity.